Leave me alone. I don't need your help. I don't need anybody.
They say the richest people can buy almost anything. The finest homes, the fastest cars, the best doctors in the world. But there comes a moment when every fortune reaches a door that money cannot unlock. And sometimes, the only person holding the key is the one nobody ever noticed. Kingston Hale spent his entire life making people believe he never needed anyone. At 40 years old, he had built Hale Dynamics into one of America's fastest-growing technology empires, owned penthouses that touched the clouds, and lived inside a mansion so grand it looked more like a private museum than a home. His employees respected him, investors admired him, and competitors feared him. Yet the one thing no headline ever mentioned was how empty his mansion became every night after the staff quietly disappeared through the back entrance. Every room echoed with silence, because Kingston believed emotions only slowed people down. Friends became business partners. Conversations became negotiations. Love became another contract waiting to expire. He convinced himself that loneliness was simply the price successful people paid. Then, in one ordinary afternoon, everything he believed shattered in less than 30 seconds. The rain had just begun when Kingston dismissed his driver, insisting he preferred driving himself after another exhausting board meeting. His fiancée, Sloane Whitaker, had spent the entire dinner discussing wedding venues, magazine photographers, celebrity guests, and luxury honeymoon destinations. She never once asked whether Kingston looked tired. She never noticed the pain hidden behind his confident smile. Their engagement had become another business merger between two powerful families, carefully planned by people who valued appearances more than affection. Kingston accepted it because it seemed easier than searching for something real. As his black luxury sedan sped through the winding mountain highway outside the city, his phone buzzed again with another message from Sloane, reminding him about tomorrow's interview with a lifestyle magazine. He glanced down for only a second. A delivery truck suddenly crossed the slippery road. Tires screamed, glass exploded, steel twisted against concrete. Then, everything disappeared into darkness. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. While news helicopters circled above the crash site, another person began her morning almost 50 miles away. Alina Mercer never imagined her name would become connected to one of the wealthiest men in America. At 31, she worked as a housekeeper through a private domestic agency, cleaning homes that looked nothing like the tiny apartment she rented with her younger brother, Micah. Every sunrise began with determination instead of complaints. She believed dignity came from how people treated others when no one was watching. Her hands carried years of hard work, but her smile remained gentle enough to comfort strangers. Since losing both parents within 3 years, Alina became everything Micah needed: a sister, guardian, provider, and quiet source of hope. Bills never stopped arriving, yet neither did her determination. She often whispered that difficult seasons could not last forever if someone kept moving forward, one honest day at a time. 3 weeks after Kingston's accident, Hale Manor felt abandoned despite its endless luxury. Marble hallways reflected soft afternoon light, expensive artwork decorated walls that nobody admired anymore, and the scent of fresh flowers could not hide the heaviness filling every room. Kingston had survived, but survival came at a painful cost. Multiple surgeries repaired broken bones, yet doctors warned that emotional trauma and temporary neurological complications would make recovery unpredictable. The man who once controlled billion-dollar negotiations now struggled with memory lapses, sudden frustration, and an overwhelming dependence on others. Nurses rotated in and out, therapists arrived daily, and specialists prescribed endless treatments. Still, Kingston refused nearly everyone who tried to help him. He fired caregivers within days, rejected physical therapy, and shut himself behind locked doors, convinced weakness had stolen the only identity he ever valued. When Hale Manor requested another temporary housekeeper, Alina accepted without hesitation, unaware that the assignment paid more because every previous employee had quit. The mansion intimidated her from the moment enormous iron gates opened before her. The estate stretched across rolling hills, surrounded by ancient oak trees, whose branches danced beneath golden evening light. Inside, every polished floor reflected crystal chandeliers, yet the house felt strangely cold. She expected luxury. She did not expect loneliness. During her first afternoon, she quietly cleaned the library, organized scattered books, prepared fresh towels, and treated every corner of the mansion with the same care she would have given her own home. Then, while carrying a tray upstairs, she heard something crash behind a partially open bedroom door. Kingston had fallen while trying to reach his wheelchair after stubbornly refusing assistance. Anger filled his face as shattered glass surrounded him across the hardwood floor. Before Alina could speak, he ordered her to leave. His voice carried the sharp confidence of someone accustomed to obedience. Every previous employee had done exactly that. Alina did something different. She calmly placed the tray on a nearby table, ignored his insults, knelt beside him, and simply said, "You don't have to prove you're strong to someone who's already watching you fight." For several silent seconds, Kingston stared at the woman whose uniform marked her as invisible in his world. Then, without another word, he allowed her to help him stand. Neither of them realized that a single act of quiet kindness had just changed the direction of both their lives forever. The following morning arrived wrapped in soft gray clouds, and for the first time since Kingston Hale returned home from the hospital, the mansion no longer felt completely lifeless. It was not because his condition had improved overnight, or because another expensive specialist had arrived with a revolutionary treatment. It was because someone moved through those enormous halls with genuine purpose instead of obligation. Alina Mercer treated every room as though warmth itself could become part of the furniture. She opened curtains to welcome natural light, placed fresh flowers where fading arrangements had been forgotten, and spoke politely to every member of the staff, from the groundskeeper to the elderly chef who had worked for the Hale family for nearly 30 years. None of those small gestures seemed important on their own, yet together they began changing the atmosphere inside a home that had been carrying grief long before the accident. Kingston noticed the difference, even though he refused to admit it. Every time he rolled past a window brightened by sunlight instead of heavy curtains, he quietly wondered why the house suddenly felt less empty than it had only days earlier. Kingston still fought every therapy session with stubborn determination. The man who once negotiated billion-dollar contracts now became frustrated trying to button a shirt or stand without assistance for more than a few minutes. His temper surfaced quickly whenever his body refused to obey his mind. Therapists learned to expect sharp replies. Nurses prepared themselves for impossible demands, and assistants carefully avoided conversations that lasted longer than necessary. Alina observed everything without offering pity. She understood there was a difference between feeling sorry for someone and believing in them. One afternoon, she found Kingston staring through the library window while untouched lunch sat growing cold beside him. Without asking permission, she quietly replaced the expensive silver tray with a simple homemade bowl of chicken soup, prepared by the chef using a recipe Alina had shared from her mother's kitchen years earlier. Kingston frowned, as though she had broken some unwritten rule. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered. Alina smiled gently before answering, "No, but your body did." To his own surprise, he finished every spoonful. Days slowly became weeks, and routines formed without either of them noticing. Every morning, Alina encouraged Kingston to walk one step farther than he had the day before. Every evening, she carefully organized his medication, checked that his books remained within reach, and reminded him that healing rarely happened in dramatic moments. It happened through ordinary victories repeated every single day. Kingston often responded with silence, yet he began waiting for those conversations without realizing it. She never spoke to him as though he were fragile. She challenged him when he surrendered too easily, laughed when he became unnecessarily serious, and reminded him that pride could become heavier than any physical injury. For the first time since the accident, Kingston found himself smiling without forcing it. The servants quietly exchanged surprised glances whenever they heard laughter drifting from the library. Hale Manor had not heard laughter in many years. One rainy afternoon, Kingston asked a question no employee had ever expected him to ask. "Why do you work so hard?" Alina paused while arranging books across the shelves before answering honestly. She explained how her parents passed away within a short period, leaving her responsible for raising her younger brother Micah. She described working 2 jobs while helping him finish school, postponing her own dreams because someone else needed her more. She admitted there were nights when she wondered how much longer she could keep everything together, yet every sunrise reminded her that quitting would never feed her family or change yesterday. Kingston listened more carefully than he had listened to anyone in years. He realized that the woman cleaning his mansion possessed a strength that money had never been able to purchase. She carried responsibility without bitterness, disappointment without resentment, and exhaustion without surrender. Somehow, she remained kind. As Kingston recovered physically, fragments of his life before the accident began returning with greater clarity. He remembered endless business meetings, luxury vacations that felt more like corporate events, and elegant dinners where conversations revolved around influence instead of affection. He remembered Sloane Whitaker calling him 3 times during his hospital stay before disappearing entirely once doctors explained recovery might take months rather than weeks. At first, he defended her absence by assuming she had been busy. Then he noticed she never visited. She never called his therapists. She never asked his staff whether he needed anything. The engagement ring still rested inside his bedside drawer, because wearing it reminded him of promises that suddenly felt strangely hollow. The more Kingston healed, the more uncomfortable those memories became. Late one evening, while searching for an old family photograph inside the attic, Kingston discovered something he had not expected. Hidden beneath dusty storage boxes sat dozens of handwritten journals belonging to his late mother. Curious, he carried one downstairs and began reading. Page after page described a woman deeply in love with her son, but heartbroken by the emotional distance growing between them after his father's death. She wrote that wealth had slowly convinced Kingston he needed success more than people. One sentence stopped him completely. "If my son ever loses everything except his heart, perhaps he will finally discover that it was always enough." Kingston closed the journal as tears quietly gathered in his eyes. Across the room, Alina pretended not to notice. She understood some moments deserved privacy, even when shared in silence. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. 3 sleek black vehicles rolled through the front gates, announcing an arrival that immediately changed the mood inside Hale Manor. Staff members straightened their uniforms while security hurried toward the entrance. The grand front doors opened, revealing Sloane Whitaker dressed in an elegant cream-colored designer suit, oversized sunglasses, resting perfectly against carefully styled hair, and confidence that suggested she had never truly left. She stepped into the foyer as though she still owned every room, offering polished smiles that never quite reached her eyes. Expensive perfume followed her through the marble hallway, while assistants carried shopping bags behind her. When she finally saw Kingston standing beside Alina during his morning exercises, something flashed across her face before disappearing beneath another graceful smile. She walked directly toward him, wrapped her arms around him without hesitation, and whispered softly, "I've come home, Kingston. It's time to finish what we started." Kingston remained completely still. The warmth he had begun rediscovering over the past several weeks suddenly collided with a past he was no longer certain he wanted back. Alina quietly lowered her eyes and stepped away, believing her place was no longer beside him. She had come to Hale Manor as nothing more than a temporary housekeeper, and despite everything they had shared during his recovery, she reminded herself that reality often favored people born into privilege. Yet, as she disappeared down the hallway, she failed to notice Kingston watching her leave, with an expression he had never worn before. For the first time in his life, the billionaire who always knew exactly what he wanted had no idea which path would lead him toward the future he truly deserved. He also had no way of knowing that Sloane had not returned because she suddenly remembered love. She had returned because someone had quietly informed her that Kingston Hale was becoming a very different man, and that frightened her more than losing his fortune ever could. Sloane Whitaker understood something that most people never discovered until it was too late. The easiest way to control someone's future was to remind them of their past. From the moment she returned to Hale Manor, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the mansion, the staff, and eventually Kingston himself would simply fall back into place. She greeted executives as though the engagement had never paused, instructed decorators to continue discussing wedding arrangements, and casually referred to herself as Mrs. Hale whenever visitors stopped by the estate. Anyone meeting her for the first time would have assumed she had faithfully remained beside Kingston throughout his recovery. Only the people living inside those walls knew the truth. They remembered the lonely hospital nights. They remembered unanswered phone calls. They remembered one woman arriving every morning to encourage a broken man to fight for another day, while the woman wearing the diamond engagement ring had been nowhere to be found. Those memories remained unspoken, yet they quietly shaped every conversation inside the mansion. Kingston welcomed Sloane with courtesy, but something had changed that neither of them could ignore. Before the accident, he would have rearranged meetings, canceled appointments, and adjusted entire business schedules to satisfy her requests. Now he listened carefully before responding, instead of agreeing automatically. When she spoke about luxury vacations, he asked about purpose instead of destinations. When she discussed wedding magazines, he wondered aloud whether a marriage built for public admiration could survive behind closed doors. Sloane dismissed those questions with polished laughter, blaming his recovery for making him overly emotional. She insisted that once life returned to normal, he would think like himself again. Kingston quietly wondered whether becoming himself again was exactly what frightened him. The accident had taken away his confidence for a season, but it had also stripped away distractions that once kept him from recognizing the difference between being admired and being genuinely loved. Alina sensed the growing tension long before anyone mentioned it. She became careful to keep conversations with Kingston brief whenever Sloane was nearby, convincing herself that maintaining professional distance was the respectful thing to do. She focused entirely on her responsibilities, spending longer hours organizing the mansion, helping the elderly chef prepare meals, and checking on Micah through evening phone calls after work. Yet no matter how hard she tried to remain invisible, circumstances continued pulling her back toward Kingston. One afternoon, his physical therapist arrived late, leaving Kingston frustrated after struggling alone through his exercises. Without hesitation, Alina gently corrected his posture, reminded him to slow his breathing, and counted each careful step exactly the way his therapist had taught him weeks earlier. Unknown to both of them, Sloane watched from the upstairs balcony. What disturbed her was not the exercise itself. It was the look in Kingston's eyes. He trusted Alina completely, and trust was something Sloane had spent years trying to replace with dependence. Later that evening, Sloane invited Alina into the drawing room with a smile so calm that it almost concealed the calculation behind it. She thanked her for taking care of Kingston before smoothly explaining that her services would no longer be necessary once the wedding preparations resumed. She even offered a generous financial bonus, describing it as appreciation for a job well done. Alina listened respectfully before quietly declining the money. She explained that she would leave whenever Mr. Hale personally decided he no longer required assistance, but until then, she intended to honor the employment agreement she had accepted. Sloane's pleasant expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She had expected gratitude. Instead, she encountered dignity that could not be purchased. As Alina excused herself from the room, Sloane realized she was facing someone far more difficult than she had imagined. Wealth had always opened every door for her. This woman seemed guided by something entirely different. Over the following days, Kingston became increasingly curious about the life Alina rarely discussed. During one afternoon drive to a rehabilitation center, he insisted the chauffeur make an unexpected stop outside a modest neighborhood where Alina lived. She hesitated before inviting him inside, embarrassed by the simplicity of the apartment compared with the mansion he called home. Kingston stepped through the small doorway and immediately noticed framed family photographs covering the walls, secondhand furniture polished until it looked new, and the unmistakable feeling that every object inside the apartment carried love instead of luxury. Micah greeted his sister with genuine excitement after receiving news that he had earned admission into an engineering program, yet he quietly admitted he was considering declining the opportunity because tuition remained far beyond their reach. Before Alina could respond, Kingston silently observed the disappointment hidden behind Micah's hopeful smile. He recognized that expression because he had seen it reflected in his own mirror after the accident. It was the look of someone pretending everything would somehow work out while privately fearing it never would. That evening, Kingston returned to Hale Manor unusually quiet. For hours, he sat inside his late father's study, surrounded by photographs of business achievements, magazine covers, and awards celebrating financial success. None of them impressed him anymore. His thoughts kept returning to the tiny apartment, where laughter filled every corner, despite uncertainty about tomorrow. For years, he had believed wealth created security. Yet, Alina's family possessed something his billions had never managed to build. They belonged to one another. That realization stayed with him until sunrise. The following morning, without informing anyone, Kingston established an anonymous educational trust that would quietly cover every expense of Micah's university education until graduation. He instructed his attorneys that neither Micah nor Alina should ever discover the source of the scholarship. He wanted the young man's future protected, not his gratitude purchased. Sloane's frustration continued growing because Kingston no longer behaved according to expectations. He postponed discussions about the wedding, delegated corporate responsibilities he once guarded obsessively, and spent increasing amounts of time walking through the estate gardens where Alina often worked among the flowers. Their conversations remained simple. They spoke about books, childhood memories, favorite meals, music, and the strange ways people sometimes confuse success with happiness. Neither of them admitted what was quietly growing between them, because both believed crossing that line would be impossible. Kingston remained engaged. Alina remained his employee. Even the possibility of something deeper felt unfair to everyone involved. Yet, emotions rarely ask permission before taking root. They simply grow, often in places where nobody expected life to appear. Everything changed during Hale Dynamics' annual charity gala, the first public event Kingston attended since the accident. The ballroom shimmered beneath magnificent crystal chandeliers, while influential guests filled the room, wearing elegant gowns and tailored tuxedos. Sloane proudly walked beside Kingston, determined to convince everyone that their relationship remained stronger than ever. Near the end of the evening, Kingston stepped away from the crowd after feeling overwhelmed by constant attention. As he crossed a quiet hallway, he accidentally overheard voices coming from a partially opened conference room. Curious, he paused. Inside, Sloane was speaking privately with one of the company's board members. Her words struck him harder than the accident ever had. She laughed softly before saying, "Once the wedding happens, controlling Hale dynamics becomes much easier. Kingston has changed since the accident, but he'll come around eventually. He always does. Besides, people like him don't know how to live without someone making decisions for them." Kingston stood frozen outside the door as every conversation from the past suddenly rearranged itself inside his mind. He remembered the rushed wedding plans, the carefully timed return, the constant pressure to resume life exactly as it had been. For the first time, he questioned whether Sloane had ever loved him at all. Before he could step away unnoticed, another voice inside the room asked a question that made his heart sink even deeper. "What about the housekeeper? I've heard she's becoming a complication." Sloane answered without hesitation. "She'll be gone before the wedding. Everyone has a price. If money doesn't work, I'll find something else that does." End quote. Kingston quietly backed away before anyone realized he had been listening. His hands trembled, not because of lingering injuries from the accident, but because the foundation of the life he had spent years building was beginning to collapse. As he walked toward the ballroom entrance, he saw Alina standing alone near the garden doors, completely unaware that a storm had just begun moving toward both of them. What Kingston did not know was that Sloane had already set another plan into motion, one capable of destroying Alina's reputation, ending her career, and forcing her out of Hale Manor forever. There are moments in life when the truth arrives quietly instead of all at once. It does not knock down the door or announce itself with dramatic speeches. It simply places one undeniable fact beside another, until even the strongest excuses begin to fall apart. As Kingston Hale drove home from the charity gala that evening, he replayed every word he had overheard inside that conference room. For years, he had mistaken polished appearances for loyalty, elegant promises for commitment, and public admiration for genuine love. The accident had broken his body, but it had also given him something he had never possessed before: clarity. For the first time since building his empire, he looked beyond balance sheets, social status, and carefully crafted reputations. He began judging people by the quiet decisions they made when they believed no one was watching. By that measure, the woman who dusted his bookshelves possessed more character than many executives seated around his boardroom table. The next morning began with unusual tension throughout Hale Manor. Staff members whispered nervously as security officers searched storage rooms, offices, and guest suites. An expensive diamond necklace belonging to Sloane Whitaker had reportedly disappeared during the previous evening's preparations. She remained calm while insisting she did not wish to accuse anyone unfairly, but her carefully chosen words pointed attention toward one person without ever speaking her name directly. Several employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. The mansion employed dozens of people, yet everyone understood who had recently gained the closest access to the family. Within an hour, the estate manager reluctantly informed Alina that, until the matter was resolved, she would need to remain available for questioning. Alina stood silently as confusion slowly gave way to heartbreak. In all her years of honest work, no employer had ever questioned her integrity. She searched every face in the room, hoping someone would simply say they knew she would never steal. Instead, most lowered their eyes, unwilling to challenge the future Mrs. Hale. Kingston arrived moments later, after returning from an early rehabilitation appointment. The silence inside the foyer immediately told him something was wrong. When he learned about the missing necklace, he looked directly toward Sloane before asking a single question. "Has anyone actually seen Alina take it?" The room remained silent. Sloane gently suggested that valuable items occasionally disappeared during times of transition, and that no conclusion should be rushed. Her calm voice almost sounded reasonable, but Kingston now recognized the careful precision behind every sentence. Instead of responding emotionally, he requested that every security recording from the previous 48 hours be brought directly to his private office before anyone searched another employee. Sloane hesitated for only a fraction of a second before agreeing. It was the smallest pause imaginable, yet Kingston noticed it immediately. While technicians gathered surveillance footage, Alina quietly packed her belongings inside the small staff quarters. She had already decided she would leave regardless of the investigation's outcome. Remaining at Hale Manor after such humiliation no longer felt possible. She folded each uniform carefully into a worn suitcase, pausing only when she reached the handwritten thank you note Kingston had once left beside a bouquet of flowers after completing one particularly difficult therapy session. It contained only one sentence. "You reminded me that healing begins when someone believes you're worth saving." Alina held the note gently before placing it inside her purse. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Loving someone whose world belonged somewhere far above her own had always seemed impossible. Now she understood that even the quiet hope she had tried to ignore was something she would have to leave behind. Inside Kingston's office, dozens of security recordings played across several monitors. Hour after hour showed nothing unusual until one camera overlooking the west hallway revealed something everyone had overlooked. Shortly after the charity gala ended, one of Sloane's personal assistants entered the guest suite where the necklace had supposedly disappeared. Minutes later, the same assistant quietly placed a small jewelry box inside a linen cabinet located near the staff corridor. Another camera captured Sloane herself, speaking privately with the assistant moments beforehand. Kingston watched every second without saying a word. The room became completely silent. The estate manager slowly removed his glasses, while the head of security replayed the footage twice to ensure there had been no mistake. The evidence was undeniable. Before anyone could react, Kingston stood, walked calmly into the main foyer where staff members had gathered, and asked Sloane one final time whether she wished to tell everyone the truth herself. For several long seconds, Sloane maintained her composure. Then she realized every pair of eyes inside the mansion had shifted toward her. Her confidence finally cracked. She admitted arranging the accusation, insisting she only wanted Alina removed because Kingston had become emotionally attached to someone who could never belong in his world. She argued that she had protected their future together, reminding Kingston of everything their marriage represented: wealth, influence, family legacy, and business stability. Kingston listened quietly until she finished. Then, with more sadness than anger, he reached into his pocket and removed the engagement ring he had carried since leaving the hospital. He placed it gently into Sloane's hand before saying, "You were right about one thing. My life has changed since the accident. I finally learned that a future built without trust isn't a future at all." No one inside Hale Manor spoke as Sloane slowly walked toward the front doors, leaving behind the life she had spent years trying to secure. Kingston immediately turned toward the staff and publicly apologized to Alina for allowing circumstances to place her honor in question. Yet, when he looked across the foyer, she was already gone. Her suitcase had disappeared. The driveway stood empty, except for the morning sunlight stretching across the stone path leading toward the estate gates. Panic, unlike anything he had ever experienced, rushed through him. Weeks earlier, he could barely stand without assistance. Now, ignoring the protests of doctors and security alike, Kingston walked farther than he had since the accident, determined to find the woman who had quietly rebuilt his life while expecting nothing in return. He found Alina sitting alone at a small neighborhood bus stop, several miles from the mansion, her suitcase resting beside her as autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk. She looked surprised to see him standing there without his wheelchair, breathing heavily after insisting his driver stop several streets away so he could walk the remaining distance himself. Kingston smiled through the exhaustion before speaking words he had never imagined saying to anyone. "When I lost the life I thought I wanted, you never treated me like a billionaire. You treated me like a human being. You taught me that strength isn't measured by how many people work for you. It's measured by how many people feel safe standing beside you." I don't know what tomorrow looks like, and I can't promise perfection, but I know I don't want another tomorrow that doesn't include you. Alina remained silent for several moments as tears finally escaped the courage she had carried for so long. She reminded Kingston that they came from completely different worlds, that people would question their relationship, and that many would assume she had fallen in love with his fortune instead of his heart. Kingston gently shook his head. The people who matter watched you love me when I had nothing left to offer except frustration, pain, and uncertainty. They already know the truth. For the first time since meeting him, Alina allowed herself to believe that happiness did not always belong to those born into privilege. Sometimes it found ordinary people whose extraordinary kindness quietly transformed everyone around them. 1 year later, Hale Manor looked remarkably different. The mansion remained magnificent, but it finally felt like a home instead of a monument to success. Employees were treated as extended family rather than invisible workers. Scholarships funded the education of children whose parents served on the estate, inspired by Micah, who had graduated near the top of his engineering class, through the anonymous scholarship that Kingston eventually admitted providing. New charitable programs offered rehabilitation services to accident survivors unable to afford treatment, because Kingston never forgot the lonely season that changed his life forever. The boardroom that once celebrated profits above everything else now measured success by the lives their company improved alongside the business it built. As for Kingston and Alina, their story became one people often misunderstood from the outside. Some believed a billionaire had rescued a struggling housekeeper. Those who truly knew them understood the opposite had happened first. Before love ever entered the picture, one compassionate woman rescued a lonely man from becoming imprisoned by the very wealth he had spent his life chasing. The mansion gave her a place to work, but her kindness gave that mansion a soul. And perhaps that is the greatest reminder any of us can carry. Money can build extraordinary houses. It can purchase comfort, influence, and admiration. But only love, humility, and quiet acts of compassion can transform a house into a home, and a successful man into someone genuinely worthy of sharing that home with another heart. And if this story reminded you that kindness often changes lives in ways no amount of money ever can, tell us in the comments what moment touched you the most. We read every single one, and your story may inspire someone else who needs hope today. Before you go, remember this. Sometimes the people the world overlooks become the very ones who change someone's life forever. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another unforgettable story. Share this video with someone who believes kindness still exists, because one simple act of compassion can change a life in ways we never imagine. And now, we'd love to hear from you. If you were in Kingston's position, would you have chosen wealth and status, or the person who stood beside you when you had nothing left to give? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.